A broken jet and a broken man. There are some stories that begin quietly. No thunder, no fireworks, just a slow draw of breath before everything changes. This one starts in a forgotten airfield on the edge of the desert, where dust moves like ghosts over sun-bleached concrete, and the winds carry secrets no one bothers to listen to anymore. It begins with a man named Hank and a woman who arrived in silence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from. The day Isla drove up, the heat was already high enough to warp the air. Her car was spotless, foreign, sleek like something out of a magazine, but Hank barely looked up from the engine he'd been pretending to work on. That old pickup hadn't run in 6 years, but it gave him something to do with his hands, something to avoid the aching stillness in his chest. She stepped out, wearing aviators too polished for the surroundings, and walked with a kind of tension that told him she wasn't used to asking for help. Hank wiped his hands on a rag and nodded in her direction, more out of habit than curiosity. He had no interest in being needed, not anymore. "You the one they call Mac?" she asked. Her voice was calm, clipped, not local. "Used to be," he said. "Now I'm just Hank. I heard you fix things no one else can." He looked her over, sizing her up with the same suspicion he used on unfamiliar aircraft. "You heard wrong," but she didn't flinch. "I have a jet. No one's been able to fix it, not even the original designers. It's different. You got money? I have purpose." That stopped him. She motioned for him to follow, and something in her tone, something between desperation and resolve, carried more weight than her words. Against his better judgment, Hank threw the rag aside and walked out to the tarmac with her. The first time he saw the jet, his breath caught in his throat. It didn't belong here, not in this dusty graveyard of forgotten things. Sleek lines, silver body dulled by salt and sand, twin engines tucked beneath the wings like the claws of a raptor. It looked wounded and expensive. "Where the hell did you get this?" he muttered. Isla didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened the hatch and stood back. "Will you look at it?" Hank hesitated. This was the kind of thing he'd sworn never to touch again. Not after what they did to him, not after they stripped his uniform, his dignity, his future. But as he stepped inside the jet, something inside him stirred, half dread, half something he'd forgotten he could feel. The cabin was gutted, stripped down to raw insulation and exposed wiring. It had been patched and prodded, taken apart by too many hands that didn't know what they were doing. But beneath the mess, there was a heartbeat. Faint, maybe, but there. "You said nobody could fix this?" he asked, crouching by the control panel. She nodded. "Everyone gave up, or got scared." "Scared of what?" She looked away. "It doesn't matter. I was told you might be different." He didn't answer. The truth was, he wasn't, not anymore. Still, his fingers were already tracing the console, feeling the stress fractures beneath the surface, the way a doctor might check a patient's pulse. Something about the jet. It felt wrong, but not hopeless. He stood up slowly. "I'll need time and parts, and I don't promise anything." "I don't need a promise," she said. "Just try." Later that night, Hank stood alone in the hangar, the overhead lights casting sharp shadows on the floor. He stared at the jet like it might wake up and speak to him. It had a nameplate on its side, faded by the sun. Astra 4. He'd never seen one in person, just schematics passed between whisper networks during his years in covert tech. Why was a ship like this here? Why had she come to him? He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, the smoke curling around his face as he watched the jet through narrowed eyes. "I'm too old for this," he muttered to no one. But somewhere, deep inside the machine, something clicked, a mechanical sigh, like it was waiting for him. The machine that refused to live. The next morning, Hank returned to the hangar before the sun even kissed the ridgeline. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Not with that jet in his head, those curves, that impossible design, that quiet whisper it left behind like a ghost in his bones. He told himself he was just curious, that it didn't mean anything, but deep down, he knew better. He started with the basics: exterior structure, engine integrity, avionics. What he found didn't make sense. "This thing should have never flown," he murmured, crouching beneath the wing. The undercarriage bore the marks of hard landings, scuffed metal, showing signs of emergency patchwork. But the interior, especially the wiring, that was another story. Every inch of it had been modified in strange, non-standard ways, not just field repairs. These were layered alterations, like someone had been hiding something or trying to make the aircraft something it was never meant to be. It made him uneasy. He crawled into the cockpit again and pried open the main console. The moment he touched the access panel, a spark jumped, not from power, but memory. He'd felt this before, not with jets like these. He'd never worked on anything so high-end, so clearly designed for luxury. But during a brief deployment in Northern Europe, he'd once assisted in recovering a prototype stolen by a dissident faction. It had been retrofitted in a similar way. The patchwork, the foreign software, the kind of tampering that only made sense if you were hiding someone or something. He leaned back in the pilot's seat and let the thought settle. The Astra 4 wasn't just broken, it had been wounded, stripped down, opened up and stitched together again with a surgeon's desperation. And now, it was dead. He ran diagnostics through his own gear. He didn't trust whatever was left on board. Most systems refused to respond. Avionics was scrambled. The neural sync module, a rare component that allowed minimal AI interpretation of pilot behavior, was completely offline. But not fried, just disconnected. He stared at it, this little brick of black glass tucked beneath the pilot's console. And for the first time in years, Hank felt the old ache in his chest, the pull to bring something back that the world had already given up on. He slid out of the cockpit and reached for his tools. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky and dipped low, and still Hank worked. His fingers moved like they remembered, like his body had been waiting for this. Each screw and circuit he touched seemed to push back at him, as though the machine was testing him, asking if he really wanted to try. And he did. God help him. He did. By dusk, Isla returned. She didn't say a word, just leaned against the hangar door and watched. He didn't look at her. "She's not just broken," he muttered. "She's been gutted and reprogrammed. And whatever her original mission was, someone tried real hard to erase it." Isla stepped inside, her boots soft against the concrete. "Can you fix her?" Hank exhaled through his nose. "Fixing her isn't the problem. She's not responding because she doesn't want to. She's a machine," Isla said, voice flat. He turned slowly. "You've been in her. You've flown her before." Her silence was confirmation. "Then you know," he continued, "that this thing doesn't operate like other jets. She's intuitive, smart, part of a short-lived European defense experiment, if I'm not mistaken. Designed to interpret the pilot's needs, think, adapt, react. And right now," he tapped the hull, "she's done reacting." Isla stepped closer, now clearly shaken. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "she's scared." It sounded ridiculous out loud, and yet he knew it was true. Not in the way a person is scared, of course, but the system, its AI sync, was locked down so tightly it resembled trauma, a shut-off response, a retreat. He knew the look. He'd seen it in soldiers, in mirrors. "She's not going to fly for just anyone," Hank added, softer now. There was a long pause. Then Isla said, almost in a whisper, "What if I told you she wasn't meant to?" He narrowed his eyes. "You want to elaborate on that?" "But," she shook her head. "Not yet." Hank sighed. He hated riddles, but he hated walking away from something that needed fixing even more. That night, he sat outside the hangar on an old folding chair, a can of warm beer in his hand, watching the stars blink into place. The desert cooled fast, but the heat inside him didn't fade. Not this time. He kept hearing the silence inside. The Astra 4, that strange emptiness, like it was holding its breath. And he couldn't stop thinking about Isla. The way she watched the jet like it was someone she loved, not a machine, a person. He took another sip, set the beer down, and stood. Inside the hangar, the lights hummed faintly. He walked slowly to the aircraft, placed a hand on the cool metal of her nose, and whispered, "We're both still here. Let's figure it out, huh?" Nothing happened. But as he turned to leave, one of the cabin lights blinked on, just for a second. Then, off again. A flicker of life, or maybe, just maybe, a pulse. Her name was Isla, and she waited. The morning began quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. That weighty kind of silence that hangs in the air when something is watching, waiting. Hank felt it before he even stepped into the hangar. The jet didn't make a sound, of course, but it felt different. As if some part of it had shifted overnight, just slightly, in his direction. Isla was already there, perched on a metal crate near the entrance, hands wrapped around a thermos, eyes locked on the jet like she expected it to take off without her. She didn't greet him when he entered, and he didn't greet her either. They were past that now somehow, past introductions, past small talk. Hank knelt by the landing gear and started his inspection. "You sleep?" she asked. "No." "Me neither." Another pause. The silence was filled with the sound of tools clicking into place, the soft creak of shifting metal as he popped open another access panel. "Most people ask what's wrong with her," Hank said finally. "You haven't." Isla didn't answer right away. Then softly she said, "I already know what's wrong. I just don't know if it can be undone." Hank looked over his shoulder at her. "Try me?" She stood and walked closer, hesitating at the edge of the work zone. Her systems were altered, piece by piece, removed, replaced, but not by me. She passed through too many hands, people who didn't care or didn't understand, and she fought them. She always fought back, until she couldn't anymore. Hank nodded slowly, still listening, still watching. "I got her out the moment I could," Isla continued, "but I didn't know the damage was this deep. I thought if I brought her somewhere quiet, somewhere off-grid, she might trust again." "She?" Hank said, raising an eyebrow. Isla didn't flinch. "You know what I mean." He did, because he'd already started thinking the same way. That day passed slowly. Hank worked in long, thoughtful stretches, while Isla remained nearby, sometimes reading, sometimes pacing, sometimes just staring at the jet with eyes that didn't seem to blink. She didn't interrupt his process, but she didn't leave either. And there was something in the way she stayed that unsettled him, like she wasn't waiting on a fix, like she was waiting on a judgment. By sundown, the jet's internal systems were partially operational, still scrambled, but now responding. Hank had mapped half the control pathways and bypassed 3 security locks. The aircraft didn't fight him anymore, but it didn't help either. He stepped away to rest his hands. Isla brought over a bottle of water, which he accepted with a nod. "You always this quiet?" he asked. She smirked. "You're one to talk." Fair. They sat near the hangar door, the world outside painted orange and gold. The silence between them wasn't as sharp now, more like fabric, soft and stretched but holding. "You didn't tell me where you got her," Hank said, not accusingly, but with a kind of earned curiosity. "No," Isla agreed. "You planning to?" She looked away. "When it matters." He took a sip of water. "And what matters?" Her voice dropped just a little, enough to turn the air colder. When you decide whether you're in, really in. Hank chuckled under his breath, though it wasn't out of humor. Lady, I'm a retired vet living in a junkyard of dreams. I don't get in on anything. I'm barely out of bed most days. But you're here, Isla said. You're fixing her. He didn't answer. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust just outside, lifting it like a whisper, then dropping it again. In the distance, coyotes called, distant and tired. Then Isla asked, "Why did you leave the service?" Hank didn't respond at first. The air between them grew heavier. He stared straight ahead. That's not a story for strangers. Then stop being a stranger. He turned his head slowly to look at her. Her expression wasn't curious. It was wounded, like someone who carried her own story, too deep to speak aloud unless someone else went first. "I got burned," he said finally. Not literally, just betrayed. By who? My CO. A man I trusted more than anyone else. He falsified a report during an extraction op, blamed me for a failed system I warned him about. A kid died because of it. I brought the proof, but it was too late. The court wanted a clean scapegoat. I gave them one. Isla didn't move, didn't blink. And after? Discharge, dishonor. I drank, I disappeared, found a quiet patch of dirt and parked my ghosts here. Another long silence. Then she nodded. Thank you. For what? For not lying. Hank stared at her long and hard. Your turn. She exhaled through her nose, long and quiet. My sister is alive, but she won't be for much longer if I don't reach her. This jet, that jet, was how I was supposed to get her out. The person who helped me steal it was captured. I think they're dead now. I don't know for sure. Where is she? Overseas, a region that doesn't officially exist on any public map. Not anymore. The kind of place where borders are illusions and people disappear without names. Hank narrowed his eyes. You want me to fly her? No, I want you to revive her. I'll take care of the rest. You sure about that? She nodded once, slow and hard. I have no choice. Hank stood, brushing the dust from his jeans. You will if I fix her. He walked back to the jet. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to, because in that moment, the hangar wasn't just steel and silence anymore. It was a waiting room for miracles. A pulse beneath the panels. The days bled together. Hours marked not by clocks, but by progress. Tiny, stubborn steps forward in the dim blue glow of the hangar's overheads. Hank worked like a man possessed. He stopped shaving. He stopped checking the sky. The world outside shrank down to the confines of that aircraft, the scent of ozone and machine oil, the whisper of worn tools in his calloused hands. The jet demanded everything, and he gave it without hesitation. By the end of the fourth day, he had rewired half the avionics from scratch. He'd isolated 3 critical damage points, one in the neural sync line, another in the environmental subloop, and a third in a part of the jet that shouldn't have existed at all, an auxiliary junction buried beneath a false panel, pulsing, with dormant energy, not standard, not safe, not documented in any official schematic. He sat cross-legged on the floor for a long time, just staring at it. A single wire in his hand, the tip frayed and singed. It was warm, even disconnected. That didn't make sense. He reached for a voltmeter, hesitated, then slowly brought the tip to the wire. Nothing. But the warmth was real, faint, rhythmic, like a breath, like a heartbeat. He stood slowly, wiping his hands. He needed air. Outside, Isla stood in the red-gold dusk, arms folded, watching the sun dip behind a ridge of sandstone. Her hair was pulled back, and her expression was unreadable. She didn't turn when he walked up behind her. She's changing, Hank said. Good, Isla replied softly. No, not like that. Not just repairs. I think she's responding. Isla turned then, meeting his gaze. She knows you. No, she doesn't. Machines don't know people. You ever think maybe she's not just a machine? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Don't start that mystic AI crap with me. I've seen tech that learns, adapts, mimics emotion. But this is different. It's like she's remembering, like she's waking up, but only a little, and only when I'm near. Exactly. Exactly what? She doesn't trust people, but she senses what's real. They stood there for a long beat. Neither moved, neither blinked. Then Hank said, "You still haven't told me her original purpose." Isla glanced away. "Because it doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. If I'm rebuilding her piece by piece, I need to know what she was built for. Passenger transport, recon, covert strike?" Isla was quiet. "Please," he added, "I'm not asking for secrets. I'm asking for truth." She took a breath, then nodded. "She was built as a lifeboat." Hank blinked. "Come again?" "Not for wars, not for glory, not for missions or politics. She was designed by a woman who lost her daughter in a crossfire zone. The mother had resources, more than money, reach. She commissioned a prototype that could carry someone out of any zone on Earth without detection, with full adaptive evasion, mid-air recalibration, and automated pathfinding. Not to deliver payloads, to save lives. Hank's eyes narrowed. That's why the systems are so strange. She was never built to fight. She was built to flee. Yes, he looked back toward the hangar. Then why all the tampering? Because governments got involved, agencies. Everyone who saw her wanted to use her for other things. They tried to retrofit her for combat, surveillance, infiltration. But she resisted, every time. One by one, the systems degraded. She rejected their programming. That's not possible. And yet, Isla said, voice low, here we are. Hank let that settle in his bones. The idea of a machine not just malfunctioning, but actively pushing back against misuse. He'd heard whispers of that kind of resistance in early AI forums, rumors about adaptive modules refusing rewritten protocols, but nothing like this, nothing confirmed. And you, he said finally, you got her out. I helped, with people who didn't make it. Hank didn't press. He could see it in her face, that edge of grief too fresh to touch. I need a night, he said, to think. She nodded. Back in the hangar, the jet sat quiet again. But now, there was something else in the air, a soft thrum behind the silence, like the walls remembered what they were built to hold. Hank walked slowly toward the cockpit, hand brushing the fuselage. The metal was warm again, subtly, consistently. He climbed in, took the pilot seat, and closed his eyes. And for the first time, he felt something. Not thought, not code, a memory. Of wind on his face, of a child's laugh far away, of fire. He gasped, bolting upright, heart pounding. Nothing around him had changed. The cockpit was still dark, but he'd felt it like the jet had shared a dream. He scrambled out and sat on the floor, breathing hard, hand pressed to his chest. She wasn't just responding. She was showing him things, and they weren't his memories. Ghosts in the machine. Hank didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. He stayed in the hangar, seated just beneath the Astrofee's shadow, eyes wide and unblinking under the flickering light. What he'd felt in the cockpit wasn't a trick of exhaustion. He knew dreams, hallucinations, the frayed edges of sleep-deprived perception. But that had weight. He'd felt it. A wind that didn't exist, a child's laugh he'd never heard before, and the smell, he hadn't noticed it right away. But now it clung to his shirt, charred leather and ozone, burned upholstery, faint, old, but real. She had shown him something. He didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but it had happened. When the first hint of dawn bled into the sky, Isla entered with 2 coffees and an expression that said she'd slept even less than he had. She handed him one, sat on a nearby crate and waited. He finally spoke. You ever feel like you're working on something that's already dead? Isla didn't blink. No. Hank nodded slowly. I did, until last night. What happened? I sat in the seat, closed my eyes. He looked at her now, and I saw something that wasn't mine. Not a memory, not a thought. It was like a whisper inside my bones. What did she show you? Fire? A child? A crash maybe? But the kid was laughing. It wasn't fear, it was joy. Isla closed her eyes. Her lips moved just barely, like she was saying something silently to herself. What is it? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, with a voice stripped bare, she said, "That was Kira." He froze. "Your sister?" She was 5 when we were separated. That laugh, everyone remembered it. Even when we couldn't remember her face anymore. That's how my mother described her before Isla's voice caught, and Hank didn't press. The silence stretched out until he couldn't stand it anymore. "You said this jet was built as a lifeboat," he said. Isla nodded. "So then, she was supposed to carry Kira out." Isla's eyes shone with something dangerously close to tears. "She did." Hank's stomach turned. "You mean Kira was on board when the first time she flew?" Isla said, "Wasn't a test. It was an escape. They packed her in with 6 other kids. War zone evac, 1 pilot, no backup." "What happened?" "She made it halfway out before the signal was intercepted. A missile hit just near her left wing. Enough to knock her off course. They said she crash-landed in a dead zone. When the search teams arrived 2 days later, there was nothing left. No bodies, no wreckage. But she's here," Hank said, pointing at the jet. "Right now, you found her. Not me, someone else. A tech scavenger who recognized the alloy and brought it in piece by piece to an open-air market. I spent 4 months tracking down every part. The fuselage came last. And Kira." Isla looked away. "I don't know. Some people say no one made it. Others say she was seen later with different names in different camps. But they all tell the same story. Of a jet that screamed across the sky, broken but alive, and landed just long enough to let someone go." Hank leaned against the fuselage. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt since the military. Since the last time he held someone's dog tags and lied to their parents about how quickly it ended. "You think she's inside," he said softly. Isla nodded. "Not her body, not her mind, but maybe something, a piece, a print. These systems, this craft, it was designed to adapt to the lives it carried. Maybe she left a mark. Maybe it's more than AI." Hank rubbed his forehead. "You're asking me to believe in ghosts." "I'm asking you to believe in memory," she said. He looked up at the aircraft, the curved metal skin, the silent canopy glass, the faint pulse he could feel again now, just below the surface. Like it had been waiting for them to name her truth. "What do you call her?" he asked. "Kira," Isla said without hesitation. "Her name is Kira." Hank stood slowly, then walked to the cockpit again. This time, as he slid into the seat, something was different. The cushion was warm, not like sun-heated leather, but like breath, like presence. He placed his hands on the control column. It pulsed once beneath his fingers, then again, and then a hum, soft at first, then growing, a quiet vibration that rose through the frame and into his arms. He leaned back as the cockpit screens flickered to life, one by one, not in order, but in rhythm, like music. "No way," he whispered. "Is she responding?" Isla asked from behind. He nodded slowly. "She's not dead, not even close." "What does she want?" "I think." He stared at the screen in front of him, which now displayed a moving diagram of the world, topography shifting, cities blinking. The map zoomed eastward. "She's showing me a route. To where?" "I don't know," Hank said, "but she does." And then, just as quickly, the systems powered down. The cockpit returned to silence, but the warmth lingered. Hank climbed out and stood before Isla. "We're not dealing with old tech," he said. "We're dealing with something that remembers, Something that chooses. Isla nodded, tears finally spilling. That's what I've been trying to tell you. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't see desperation. He saw faith, unshakable, bone-deep faith, in this jet, in her sister, in something most people would call impossible. And somehow, standing in that dusty hangar, Hank wanted to believe too. He wiped his hands on a rag, set his jaw, and said, "Then we better get her ready. If she's waking up, she's going to need all her strength, and someone who'll listen." He looked at the cockpit one more time. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm listening now." Whispers. From the black box for the next 48 hours, Hank didn't leave the hangar. He slept on a blanket under Kira's wing, tools spread around him like offerings at an altar. Every moment he spent away from the cockpit felt like wasted time, like missing a breath from someone just beginning to speak again after years of silence. Something inside her had shifted. She was responding, more deliberately now. Systems that were once inert now pulsed faintly under his touch. The diagnostic screens, once blank, began revealing fragments of encrypted logs. Not full recordings, not speech, just flashes of text, glitches of memory. One appeared while he was tracing a power flow through the data bus. It blinked into life on the HUD for exactly 6 seconds before vanishing. 7 aboard, 1 still breathing. "Hold on." Hank dropped his tool. The words didn't feel like code. They felt like pleading. He scrambled up to the cockpit and re-ran the memory trace. Nothing. The message was gone. He turned to Isla, who had just come in with a thermos. She froze when she saw his face. "She spoke," he whispered. "At least, I think she did." He told her about the message. Isla's hands trembled as she unscrewed the thermos cap. "Then someone survived." "Or she thought someone did," Hank said. "Or she's reliving it. I don't know, but this isn't just data recall. These are fragments, raw emotional bursts, that kind of storage behavior. It's almost biological." Isla didn't answer. Her eyes were glassy again, as if some part of her soul was slowly catching up to something she'd believed for years, but never dared to hope was real. "She might be trying to tell us how to fix her," Hank added. "Not mechanically, but emotionally, if that even makes sense." Isla sat beside him on the wing. "Maybe you're not fixing her at all. Maybe she's fixing you." He almost laughed, but the truth cut too close. "I don't know how to process this," he said. "I've worked on jets that flew like they had personalities, sure, but I've never worked on one that remembered pain." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Isla said, "You need to open the black box." Hank frowned. "I tried. It's hard-locked, probably quantum encrypted. I'd need weeks to brute force it." "No," she said, "not the one in the panel." She stood and walked around the aircraft, then tapped a seemingly ordinary access panel along the tail section. "Here. That's not listed in the original blueprints, because it was built after," Isla said, "hidden during one of the earliest modifications, before they tried to turn her into a weapon." Hank unscrewed the plate. Inside, behind a metal casing scorched and bent in 2 places, sat a small black cube, smooth, unmarred, humming softly. He reached for it, then hesitated. "Do it," Isla said. He pulled it free. The hum intensified. As he turned it over in his hands, a faint projection shimmered above it, images barely holding shape. Static, snow, and then a flickering video, the inside of the jet. 7 seats, 1 small girl, laughing, looking right at the camera. "Kira," Isla whispered. Her voice broke on the name. The video was silent, but it didn't need sound. Hank could feel it, feel what the memory meant. He watched as the camera shook, an impact, flashing red, smoke filling the cabin. The girl disappeared behind a blur of light, and then Darkness. The cube went dark too. He stood frozen. That wasn't just surveillance, he said. That was a memory, a recorded imprint, and that was her last moment before the crash. She was alive, Isla said. You saw her. But what happened next? He turned to the aircraft. What did you do? As if on cue, a console light blinked to life, not in the cockpit, along the port side, a service bay usually reserved for coolant diagnostics. They ran. Inside, a hidden drawer slid open, revealing something that stopped them both cold. A child's bracelet. Beads melted in places, with the faint letters K-I-R-A. Isla reached for it but stopped short. Her fingers hovered in the air. She was here, she said, voice cracking. She made it through the impact. Hank crouched beside the drawer, staring into its shallow depth. There was no ash, no blood, no evidence of remains, but the bracelet was proof enough. Maybe, he said slowly, she got out. But where would she go? Isla asked, eyes scanning the hangar like the girl might suddenly appear in the shadows. Hank stood. If Kira survived and the jet was found abandoned, it means she made the landing and someone found her. Maybe a scavenger, maybe a medic. But they didn't find this compartment. They found the girl and left. The rest, Isla swallowed hard. So we need to find them. No, Hank said. Kira doesn't want us to find them. Isla looked up sharply. She wants us to finish what she started. What do you mean? She brought someone out. She saved them. That was her purpose, right? Isla nodded. Then this jet, this mind, this soul. She's showing me the route again. I checked. The flight path overlay. It ends in the same mountain pass every time. He turned the display toward her. A cluster of peaks, sparse villages, some no longer even marked, and a single blinking dot. Someone's still out there. Isla stared at the screen. You think she wants to go back? No, Hank said. I think she wants us to. The silence that followed was electric. Neither moved, both breathing shallow. Then we follow her lead, Isla said. He looked at the jet again. No longer a relic, no longer a machine. She was a guide, a grieving witness, a silent survivor, and maybe something more. She's almost ready, Hank said. Give me another day. Isla stepped forward, her hand resting on the hull. Take all the time you need, she whispered. Just don't keep her waiting too long. The map only she could draw the next day, Hank hardly spoke. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of Kira's body, her wiring, her hidden panels, her memories. But something in his mind had expanded too. A door he'd never dared open was now swung wide, and behind it stood not logic or protocol, but a pulse. Slow, steady, and undeniably alive. Kira, the aircraft, had begun to lead him. It started with temperature fluctuations. A patch of fuselage warmed when he walked past, directing him like a spotlight. Then a low vibration, guiding his fingers to a hidden latch he'd overlooked. And each time he followed her cues, she gave him more. Maps, logs, coordinates, like a child tugging at a parent's sleeve, saying, "This way, keep going." And Hank obeyed. The route she showed wasn't a clean arc or a strategic flight path. It was jagged, inconsistent, looping back in places, cutting across terrain like a desperate, hand-drawn map. But the terrain, once he studied it, wasn't random. It formed a story, each point marked where she'd either lost someone or found someone. Kira, the girl, hadn't just survived the crash. She'd been moving from one checkpoint to another, and at each one, the Astra 4 had recorded something. Audio pulses, proximity pings, faint biometric traces, like a ship tagging stars across a night sky, building a constellation of presence. She didn't crash and burn, Hank murmured as he traced the path with his finger. She landed, she wandered, she was looking for something or someone. Isla leaned over the console beside him. Or she was being led. By what? Isla tapped the central display. By her, the jet. Maybe this whole time, Kira wasn't the one steering. That thought stopped Hank cold. You think this thing guided a child across a war zone? She was never alone, Isla said. Not if Kira stayed with her, not if she kept walking. Toward the voice, it made a strange kind of sense. Not military logic, not physics, but emotional logic, the way a child might talk to their stuffed animal, or follow the stars, or whisper secrets to an airplane that felt like home. She mapped it with her heart, Isla whispered. And Hank realized this was no evac route. It was a breadcrumb trail of grief, and maybe hope. That night, they activated the simulator module for the first time. Kira had never responded to it before, but now she played. Not just data playback, but full, immersive reconstruction. The cockpit screens displayed a first-person view, low to the ground, shaky, blurred. The perspective of a child, small legs, a frayed doll dragging beside a boot print in the mud. She recorded this, Hank said, voice low. The jet had seen through Kira's eyes. It was only a few minutes of footage, but it left Hank breathless. In the simulation, the child stopped beside a collapsed fence. Beyond it stood a collapsed monastery, half swallowed by the earth. But one room remained intact, and inside, faint lantern light. The footage ended. On screen, a single word pulsed beneath the still frame. Home. Isla gripped the edge of the console. She's showing us where she stopped. No, Hank said. She's showing us where she waited. He looked up at Kira's gleaming frame, and maybe where she's still waiting. Isla stepped back, her arms wrapped around herself like armor. What if we go there and find nothing? What if it's just ruins and shadows? Then at least we give her peace, Hank said. Either way, we finish the flight. The rest of the evening passed in reverent silence. Hank made preparations, double-checking fuel lines, updating navigational overlays, patching auxiliary comms. He wasn't just repairing anymore. He was preparing for departure, but even as he worked, he felt it, the ache of memories resurfacing. Because while Kira's story was unfolding before him, something else was stirring beneath the surface. His own ghosts. He remembered a boy from his last tour, Nolan, barely 20, fresh from flight school. Big smile, bad luck. He'd taken a hit during a dust-off, bled out before Hank could get the engine restarted. Hank had told himself 1,000 times it wasn't his fault, but deep down, he never stopped wondering what would have happened if he'd moved faster, rewired quicker. That night, as he checked Kira's aft systems, a sudden flicker of light shot across the console. An image, unprompted. Nolan's face. Only for a second. But Hank knew that smile. It was impossible. He stood, heart hammering. Isla, he called. She came running. He showed her the screen. Did you see that? I did, she whispered. Who was it? Hank swallowed. Someone I lost years ago. Isla stepped forward, placing a hand on the fuselage. Then she's not just showing you her memories. Hank's knees nearly buckled. She's reaching into mine. She's mapping emotion, Isla said. Connection, that's how she works. Not on wires and logic, but on feeling. He backed away, looking at the aircraft like it was something alien. But it wasn't, it was familiar now. Too familiar. He exhaled slowly. She's more than alive, Isla nodded. She's aware. And for the first time since they'd pulled the broken frame into the hangar, Hank understood this wasn't about repair. It was about resurrection. He ran a final diagnostic. Every system, green, fuel, stable, coordinates locked. He stood before her. You ready, Kira? A soft hum answered him. He smiled, eyes wet. Good, because I think I am too. Flight without a runway, dawn broke like a promise. Hank stood just inside the hangar's yawning doors, watching the sun rise behind the distant hills. The sky was the color of hope, pink and gold smudged with bruises, and parked in the center of the concrete floor, polished clean and humming like a heartbeat, was Kira. She looked like she'd been born to fly that morning. Isla arrived with a small pack slung over her shoulder, eyes shadowed but determined. "You're really doing this?" she asked. Hank didn't answer right away. He turned back toward the jet, walking a slow circle around her, fingers grazing the curve of her wing. "She's ready," he said softly. "You sure?" Isla asked. "She hasn't flown in over a decade. No runway, no launch crew, just this." Hank looked toward the mountain pass, glowing on the map like a quiet invitation. "It's not a flight, it's a return." They had no tower clearance, no black box beacon, no transponder pinging airspace control. But somehow, none of that mattered, because Kira wasn't meant for conventional skies. He slid the cockpit canopy open and climbed in, the seat molded to his frame. Lights flickered to life, gentler now, less warning, more welcome, like a lullaby between circuits. Isla stayed below, watching him, lips parted like she was holding back a final confession. He strapped in and placed a hand on the throttle. "You ever flown something that didn't want to fight?" he asked into the open air. "No," she said. "Only things built to destroy." "Well," he whispered, "then this is something else entirely." He tapped the ignition. For a moment, silence, then the deep, slow inhale of turbines breathing for the first time in years. The hangar lights fluttered as the power spiked, then steadied. Kira was alive, and she was listening. A low chime rang out, 3 tones, soft and crystalline, unlike anything in her original design. Hank didn't recognize it, but it didn't matter. She was singing. He eased the throttle forward. The landing gear, once rusted into place, began to glide, smooth as glass. Slowly, almost reverently, she rolled out of the hangar, her nose tilted upward toward the horizon. No one was there to wave them off. No ceremony, no flags, just the creak of old dreams waking up. They reached the edge of the cracked tarmac, what was left of the base's outer lot. Beyond it, an overgrown field stretched toward a sharp incline. And then nothing. Trees, rocks, and drop-off. Isla appeared beside him, now standing in the field, eyes fixed on him. She wasn't waving, she wasn't smiling. She was just present, and that meant everything. Hank throttled up. Wind gathered, like applause. Then he released the brakes. Kira surged forward, cutting a clean path through the weeds and fractured stone. There was no runway, no guidance, just instinct and faith. Every bump in the ground jolted Hank's spine, but he held fast. 30 yards, 50. The incline came. Rushing up, 75, 90, and then lift. No roar, no shake, just a rise, soft as if the earth itself had chosen to let go. They were airborne. The land fell away beneath them, and Hank's breath caught in his throat as Kira banked into a climb, the morning light catching her wingtips like fireflies. He looked around the cockpit. No HUD alerts, no stress warnings, just presence. She was flying herself. "I'm not the pilot," he whispered. A chime answered him, affirmation. Below, Isla shrank into the field, but her outline remained, anchored, watching, believing. The landscape blurred. They soared across jagged hills and mist-strewn valleys, following. No known airpath, just the route Kira had marked with her memories. There was no GPS, only emotion, only echoes of something unfinished. For hours they glided. Kira used power sparingly, engines shifting to silent mode across certain ridges. She knew where to hide, where to rise, where to pull close to the mountains. Shoulder and skim its side like a bird returning home. And Hank, he just let her lead, but then they reached the final turn. Up ahead, the peaks split into a narrow pass, a place even satellites hadn't touched. On the HUD, a blinking dot, just like before. Not a signal, not a beacon, a pulse. "I see it," Hank said. "We're almost there." Kira dipped slightly, almost like a bow. He throttled down, let her drift. As they rounded the last ridge, the landscape opened into a high-altitude basin, a place untouched by war or machines. Trees surrounded a flat, sunlit clearing where wildflowers bent in the breeze. And there, nestled in the center like a forgotten shrine, stood the remnants of the monastery, half collapsed, crumbling, but real. Hank circled once, then brought her in. No need for fancy maneuvers. Kira guided herself in with such grace it barely felt like landing, more like arriving. The moment the gear touched down, a memory hit him like a punch. A smell, charcoal, and wild lavender. He knew that smell. He'd smelled it once in a war zone, helping evacuate a village just before the fire came. And suddenly, he knew. This place had been sanctuary. Not just for Kira, the girl, but for others too. As he stepped down onto the clearing, wind pressing gently against his face, the air felt charged, like every molecule remembered the weight of 1,000 moments. The doors of the monastery hung open. Inside, sunlight danced on the stone floor, and in the corner, partially buried beneath a dusty tarp, was a single cot. Hank approached, heart pounding. A doll sat there, one eye missing, but on its cloth arm, the letters K-I-R-A stitched in pink. He fell to his knees. She had been here, she had waited, and someone had loved her enough to leave this untouched. Behind him, Kira, the aircraft, emitted a low, gentle tone, not mechanical, grateful. And Hank, who had spent years avoiding grief, outpacing sorrow in engine noise and wrenching silence, finally let go. He wept, and the wind, steady and unflinching, held every tear like a truth. Whispers in the stone. The monastery was more than a ruin. It breathed, not in the way machines do, not with hums or heat signatures, but in the way sacred places remember. The walls held something, like a secret too heavy to rise. Hank felt it with every step, like he wasn't walking into history, but backward through it. He moved deeper inside, past the collapsed alcoves and dust-cloaked stone benches, to a chamber at the rear, circular, untouched. The air shifted, still and heavy, but not stale. More like something waiting. A mosaic ran across the floor, cracked but intact. Not of saints, not of angels, but of wings, jet wings. Kira's silhouette, impossibly accurate, etched in tile and gold leaf right there at the center. He crouched, fingers grazing the surface. It couldn't be coincidence. Someone had seen her. Someone had known what she was, what she meant, and then he saw it. In the tiles beneath the wings, carefully embedded into the grout, half a dog tag. The name long worn away, but the numbers, he knew those numbers. They were military issue, region code, timestamp, the same block as Kira's final transmission log. She hadn't just wandered here, she'd been brought by someone who knew her origin, who saw in her not a wreck, but a home. He stood and looked around the chamber again, eyes catching on a strange shape tucked into a shadowed niche. A bundle, neatly wrapped in layers of old linen. He hesitated, then stepped forward and pulled it free. Inside, a notebook, a child's, bent, water-stained, but still legible. The cover was purple, speckled with stars drawn in ballpoint pen. He opened it. Page 1. In scrawling handwriting, "My name is Kira. I am not alone." His breath caught. He flipped through. Drawings, journal entries, some written in English, some in fractured phonetic spellings, like a child learning multiple languages by sound alone. There were sketches of the jet, labeled with words like friend, safe, sky house. And then, halfway through the notebook, I walked 3 days. She was with me. She sings when I'm scared. Below that, a page covered in nothing but musical notation, handwritten, imperfect, but oddly consistent, a melody, the same three. Notes Kira had chimed when Hank powered her up for the first time. Tears blurred the ink. He sat down in the quiet, letting the weight of it all sink in. The child had lived here, drawn comfort from the aircraft, been held somehow by something no one else could touch. Isla was right, he whispered. She wasn't flying a machine. She was holding on to family. He flipped to the final page. There, a message, not in Kira's handwriting. This one was neater, adult. It read, "Found her sleeping, protected her here. Don't know how she survived, but I believe now. Whatever you are, thank you." No name, no date. Just an ending that sounded like faith. He set the notebook down and stood. Kira, the aircraft, had gone silent. No systems pinging, no gentle hums. Just presence. It was as if she'd settled, like a deep exhale after carrying something heavy for far too long. Hank walked back out into the light. The valley felt different now. Lighter. The weight had lifted. He approached the jet and placed his palm on her side. "You found her," he whispered. "You brought her here." The fuselage was warm. I don't know how. I don't know why you could feel, but I'm glad you did. He stayed like that for a while, just breathing with her. Then the cockpit screen flickered on. One word appeared. Peace. He smiled. "Yeah, that's what this is." And then, something unexpected, an image flickered on the screen. It was grainy, clearly old, but unmistakable. Kira, the girl. She was seated on a crate beside the aircraft, legs swinging, hair tied with frayed ribbon, smiling. Beside her, a woman, military fatigues, laugh lines and dirt-streaked skin, hand resting gently on Kira's shoulder. The image froze. Hank stared, not at the girl, at the woman. His pulse skipped. He knew her, not from the war, not from service, from the base, from the day they wheeled Kira into his hangar. The woman who signed off the contract. The silent one, standing in the background, watching with those unreadable eyes. She hadn't spoken much, just handed him the clipboard, faded into the crowd. And now, here she was, in the photo. She hadn't been a bureaucrat. She had been family. Maybe the one who found Kira, maybe the one who stayed with her, maybe the one who left that doll, that book. The silence of the base visit suddenly made sense. She hadn't been trying to offload a broken jet. She had been sending her home. And Hank? He was just the one meant to carry her the last few miles. He stepped back, exhaling. The jet systems dimmed. The image remained. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the medallion from his last tour. The one Nolan had given him, the same one Kira had flashed onto the cockpit screen during diagnostics. He hung it on a rivet beneath the cockpit window. "Thank you," he whispered. The wind rustled the trees. Not a reply. But maybe not silence either. Silence either. That night, he set up a small campfire just beyond the clearing. He didn't eat much, didn't sleep. He just sat beside the girl he'd never met, and the machine that had never stopped searching. He read the journal cover to cover, laughed at her sketches, cried at her fears, felt his own memories shifting, reshaping. He thought about Isla, about what he'd tell her when he returned, about what he had become out here in the silence. And he knew this journey had changed everything, not just for Kira, not just for the jet, but for him, because somehow in all this wreckage, he'd finally found his way back to himself. The offer that changed everything. The road back was longer, not by distance, but by what he carried now. Hank left the monastery at sunrise. He'd packed nothing except the journal and a small cloth square from the doll's dress, folded neatly. In his chest pocket, Kira, the aircraft, had powered down entirely. No prompts, no pings, just stillness, like she was finally asleep, and he knew he couldn't wake her again, not without undoing the peace she'd earned. He made the hike back on foot, 14 miles through mountain terrain, 14 miles of thinking, reliving, undoing, remembering. By the time he reached the outskirts of the abandoned base, Isla was already there, leaning against her jeep, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon. When she saw him, her breath caught and she walked forward, slow but certain. "You came back," she said. "I had to," he replied. He handed her the journal, no explanation, just the weight of it in her hands. She flipped through a few pages, eyes widening, breath trembling. Then she looked up, voice cracked and barely audible. "So it's all true?" "Yeah," Hank said. "And more." They didn't talk much after that, not until the sun dipped low and the sky flushed, orange with the kind of quiet that demands answers. Adler poured them each a cup of coffee from her thermos. They sat on the tailgate of her jeep, staring out at the hangar where Kira had once rested. "I've spent years fixing things," Hank said finally. "Machines, engines, stuff people gave up on. Thought it made me feel useful." Isla glanced sideways. "It did." He shook his head slowly. "No, I was hiding. Turns out it wasn't the machines I wanted to fix." She didn't push, didn't have to. He turned to her. "Do you know who she was? The woman in the photo? With the girl?" Isla nodded. "Major Elena Aras. She was part of a covert medevac unit stationed near the original crash zone. Got discharged early, never filed a report on the girl. Went completely off. The grid. I saw her," Hank said. "Back when they gave me the jet. She handed me the forms, never said a word." "She was saying plenty," Isla murmured. "You just had to listen." Silence passed between them, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then Isla reached into her bag and handed him a small, sealed envelope. "This came yesterday," she said. He opened it. Inside, a letter from the Department of Civil Aeronautics, unsigned, black bar stamped, brief. "Thank you for your service. We've reviewed the disposition of prototype asset K11R4, deemed non-operational. Removal from the active inventory is confirmed. You may retain possession under private status." He stared at the words, then looked up. "They're giving her to me." Isla nodded. "They don't know what she is, but they know you fixed her, and somehow they trust you more than they fear her." "She's not mine." "No," Isla said, "but you're hers." He folded the letter carefully, as if it might crack under pressure. "She's not flying again," he said. "She doesn't need to," Isla replied. A long pause, then, "You could stay out here, you know," she added gently. "Make a home of this place. You've earned it." He smiled faintly. "I think I need to bring her story back, not bury it here." Isla tilted her head. "How? I don't know. Maybe start with this." He held up the journal. "Tell the truth. Not about weapons or engineering, about people, about how we hold on." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Then you'll need help." "What kind of help?" She took a deep breath, then offered something he hadn't expected. "I've got clearance," she said. "Connections in restoration, transport, archives, and I've got time now." Hank blinked. "Are you saying—" "I'm offering to stay in this with you, however long it takes, whatever it becomes." He looked at her, really looked, and all the years he'd spent walking out of rooms before anyone could ask him to stay, they finally stopped meaning something. "You're serious?" he said. "I am," she replied, "because if you're going to carry this story, someone's got to make sure you don't carry it alone." He swallowed. His voice shook. "Why?" Isla leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Because I've seen what happens to soldiers who bury too many ghosts, and I've seen what happens when one of them finally chooses not to." Hank didn't answer. He didn't need to. He extended his hand. She took it, and for the first time in a long, long while, he believed in tomorrow. They spent that night inside the hangar, not working, not scheming, just being. Isla read more of the journal. Hank told her about the moment Kira lifted from the earth, They shared stories, some true, some half-invented, some from dreams they hadn't realized they'd had. Before they turned in, Isla set a tiny paper lantern on the floor and lit the wick. It rose slowly, wobbling, and caught a draft near the cracked roof. It floated up, twirling once before it disappeared through the broken beam, trailing light. Behind it, like a wish too gentle to say aloud. "She would have liked that," Hank whispered. Isla leaned back, gaze never leaving the ceiling. "She's part of the sky now," she said, "but she left something behind." Hank nodded. "Not just the jet, not just the journal, but hope. Echoes that don't fade." The weeks that followed blurred into something weightless, like the kind of time that doesn't tick forward so much as settle. Hank and Isla didn't rush. There was no schedule, no supervisor, just a shared understanding that what had been left behind in that monastery was too sacred to handle carelessly. The jet remained, untouched, exactly where it was. Neither of them made any move to haul it back to civilization. Something about that valley, that quiet slice of sky, felt more like hers than any museum ever could. But they documented everything. Every page of Kira's journal was scanned and preserved. Every detail in the mosaic was photographed from different angles, with Hank even crawling on his stomach at one point to get a shot under a collapsed arch. He cursed the dust. Isla laughed at his scraped elbow, and for a moment it felt like they were kids playing archaeologist again. Isla took lead on contacting a preservation team. Small, discreet, and trustworthy. People who didn't just understand history, but respected it. The day the team arrived, none of them touched the jet. One woman, a historian with glacier white hair and soft eyes, stood in front of Kira's cockpit for a long time. She didn't speak, just bowed her head like she was in the presence of something holy. That night, around a fire, she shared her thoughts. "You know what this is, right?" she asked quietly. "This isn't a machine. It's a memory made solid, something that refused to forget." And Hank felt it then, more than ever. Kira hadn't just carried a child. She'd become her grief, her shelter, her wings, the physical form of a love too stubborn to die. And when that child left, she waited, because that's what family does. They wait for the ones they love to come home, even if they never do. Back in the hangar where Hank once tried to rebuild her, they started a new project. Not restoration, not modification, a replica. Kira's systems had all been archived digitally thanks to Hank's earlier diagnostics. The fuselage dimensions, engineering structure, even the audio files. They printed everything they could on sheets of drafting paper. Blueprints unrolled across tables like scrolls of scripture. They weren't trying to recreate her, they were trying to tell her story in a form people could see. Hank handled the structure. Isla documented the emotional history. Each entry in the accompanying display read like a page from the journal, not a museum plaque. There were fingerprints in the margins, smudges from coffee, stories that hurt and healed at the same time. They debated what to call the exhibit. At first, it was just prototype K11R4, but that felt wrong. Hank suggested Kira's wings. Isla shook her head. Too technical. They tossed around options for days until one night, Isla handed him a slip of paper, one word written on it, held. He looked up and understood. Because the entire story, every part of it, wasn't about the jet or the war or the crash. It was about being held by machines, by strangers, by memories, by choices. And how sometimes in the darkest hour, all we want is to know someone will wrap around us and not let go. He nodded. That's it. The exhibit launched in a quiet gallery on the edge of the country. Not a headline-grabbing location, just a space that felt honest. You could walk through it in 10 minutes or linger for hours. Visitors entered through a narrow hall where Kira's journal pages were backlit on glass. Children's voices were piped softly into the speakers, reading lines from the journal aloud, unpolished, stumbling, real. One little boy's voice cracked as he read, "She's my sky house. She's my sky house. I don't have to be scared when she sings," and grown men wept. No one expected that, not even Hank. He watched from the corner the first week, silent and stunned, as person after person walked out changed. A war widow who whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. A veteran who sat in front of the replica and didn't move for 40 minutes. A teenager who came back 3 days in a row just to touch the railing near the wing. Isla stood beside Hank during most of it. Sometimes they didn't talk, sometimes they did. But what mattered most was presence, the one thing Hank never let himself ask for, and now couldn't imagine living without. "I think she'd be proud," Isla said one afternoon. He looked at her. "Of the exhibit?" "No," she replied. "Of you." A month later, a letter arrived, handwritten, from a woman in the Northeast, aged 67, who claimed to have once seen the real Kira flying overhead decades ago during a storm that stranded her family in the woods. She said the plane circled above for hours, lights pulsing in patterns, until someone finally found them the next morning. "I didn't know how to describe what I saw," she wrote, "but I remembered the feeling, like someone knew we were there. Like someone stayed with us, watching, refusing to leave. She'd never told anyone, not until she saw the exhibit. I just wanted you to know," the letter concluded. "She wasn't a ghost. She was Grace." Hank read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the original journal. Beneath the last page, another voice added to the story, another echo that refused to fade. One night, as the gallery closed, Hank stood alone in front of the replica. The lights were dimmed. The soft hum of the audio system pulsed through the space. 3 familiar notes in sequence. The melody from the journal. Her melody. He smiled, tears stinging his eyes, and he whispered like a secret only the walls could hear, "You did good, girl. You held on. And now, you're holding us." He rested his hand on the wingtip. It was smooth, cold, inanimate, but somehow it felt like coming home. The letter. She left for him. It arrived with no warning, no postage, no return address, just a cream-colored envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of Hank's truck, left in the gallery's back lot. He'd finished another long day answering questions from visitors, some curious, some reverent, all of them touched by the story of Kira and the girl. He'd stayed late with Ela, discussing a school program they were planning to launch. Something to help kids understand loss, memory, and resilience. He was tired, but not the bad kind, the full kind, the kind of tired that comes with meaning. So when he saw the envelope, his first thought was logistics, a request, a complaint, something left by an intern. But when he peeled it open, the moment froze. The handwriting was hers. Aras. The woman from the photograph. The same face that had stared back at him from dusty files and blurred security footage. The one who'd walked away from the base years ago and had never been heard from again. Now, her words were in his hands. He sat in the truck, fingers trembling slightly, and read, "To the man who brought her back, I don't know your name, but I know your hands. I saw what you did to her wings. I saw the gentleness in your welds, the reverence in your calibration. I know you didn't treat her like a machine. You treated her like a promise." Hank blinked hard. The ink blurred. "You need to know. The girl wasn't mine by blood, but she was mine by everything else. I found her after the convoy was hit, barely breathing, wrapped in burlap, no name, no number, just a sound she kept repeating. Kira. I don't know if it was her mother's name, or a prayer, or a word she made up to stop herself from disappearing. I kept her alive for 3 days with melted snow and powdered rations. Then I loaded her into the one thing I still trusted, Kira." The letter went on. She described the flight, how she'd overridden the base's orders. how she'd taken the child over the border and dropped her at a makeshift refugee clinic staffed by nuns who didn't ask questions. And then, Aras said, she returned. I came back to a court-martial order. They let me keep my silence in exchange for walking away. No records, no pension, just a ghost story and a choice. Vanish or let her memory vanish. I chose to vanish, but I've watched. I've seen the footage, the gallery, the replica. I saw the paper lantern you sent into the sky. I saw how people cried reading her words. You gave her more than repair. You gave her voice. That was something I could never do. Thank you for that. Hank's chest ached as he read the last lines. I live quiet now. Mountains, rain, no clocks. I won't come back, not because I don't care, but because she deserves peace. You've given her that, and you've reminded me why I did it all. Sometimes love is a decision you make without applause. Sometimes the only reward is knowing someone somewhere remembers. Keep remembering, keep holding. Aras. The letter ended without a date, without a location, just her name, written in script like wind across water. Hank folded the paper with reverence. He didn't cry, not right then. Instead, he sat there for a long time, feeling something settle inside his chest, like a gear clicking into place after years of misalignment. She hadn't disappeared. She'd been watching. And maybe, just maybe, that was the final proof he needed that this wasn't a story about machines at all. It was a story about witness, about how people carry each other, even when they can't be seen. He brought the letter to Isla. She read it in silence, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes shining. When she looked up, her voice cracked. We need to add this. No, Hank said softly. Not to the exhibit, she frowned. Why not? Because this wasn't meant for the world, he said. This was meant for the storyteller. He placed the letter in a cedar box he'd built by hand, small, square, simple, lined it with cloth, and beneath the journal, beneath the folded scrap of the doll's dress, he placed Aras's letter. Then he closed the lid and locked it with a brass clasp. It wouldn't be on display, but it would exist. It would be held. That night, Hank stepped out onto the back porch of the gallery. The sky stretched above him, quiet and endless, and then a faint sound, a high-pitched whine, familiar, fleeting. He looked up instinctively, heart racing. But the sky was empty, just stars, just wind, just the hush of night brushing across the fields. He smiled slowly. She's not flying, he whispered. Not here. He turned back inside, and on the hallway wall near the exhibit's exit, someone had scribbled a message in pencil, just 4 words, scrawled beneath the final image of Kira. She held us too. Hank stood there for a long time, hand pressed gently to the wall, and in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't the end, not even close. The visitor in the blue scarf, she didn't stand out at first, not in the way you might expect someone important to. No camera crew, no entourage, just a woman in a blue scarf, walking slowly through the gallery like she wasn't entirely sure her feet were touching the floor. Hank noticed her the moment she entered. There was a stillness about her, like the air adjusted around her presence, made room for her. He kept his distance at first. He'd learned not to interrupt moments that didn't belong to him. She walked through the journal display, with her fingers trailing just above the glass, never touching it. Stopped in front of a panel where Kira had written, I think maybe she flew before she had wings. Maybe that's why she trusted me. And that's when the woman's breath caught. Hank saw it, a soft intake, shoulders tightening, jaw clenching, like a wave had just knocked something loose inside her ribcage. She moved on, past the child's voice reading aloud, past the cockpit simulation with the stitched fabric seat, past the folded scarf on display that Isla had added just last week, the one Kira had wrapped around the child's feet during the final flight. And then she reached the replica, the full-scale body of Kira, silver and scarred, wings like arms. In mid-reach, the woman walked to the left side, pressed her hand flat against the panel just beneath the emergency hatch. She stayed like that for minutes. Hank stepped closer, cautiously. "You knew her," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't flinch, didn't turn. She just answered calmly, "She saved my life." His heart thudded. He took a breath, and she turned then, finally, her face soft and strong, lined with years but radiant with something that flickered far beneath the surface. "You're the girl," he said. She nodded once, not proudly, not dramatically, just truthfully. "My name's Solon," she said. "Short for Solène. She used to whisper it when I cried. Said it meant dignity under weight. I never knew if that was true or if she just made it up to keep me from unraveling." Hank smiled, stunned. He looked down at her scarf, faded blue cotton, frayed at the edges. "Is that—" "Yes," she said. "I kept it. Through every foster home, through every border crossing. Through the years I didn't remember my name, but I remembered her." He didn't know what to say, so he let silence speak for him. Solon walked him through what she knew, what she'd remembered over time. That her earliest memory was heat, dry, stinging heat, and the sound of a woman's voice singing softly in a language she couldn't name. That for years she'd had dreams of flying without seeing anything around her, just floating, warm and safe, with hums of music playing in her bones. That one day, while researching aviation technology at her university, because yes, she'd become an engineer herself, she'd stumbled across a classified case study about a decommissioned prototype with unique modifications. A file marked K11R4, and the memory had slammed into her, not like a flashback, like a recognition, like something buried had finally pushed its way back to the surface and gasped for air. "I didn't know who to contact," she said. "Didn't even know if I'd gone mad. But when I saw the news about the exhibit and the name Kira," she swallowed. "I knew I had to come." Hank asked the question before he could stop himself. "Do you remember her face?" Solon looked away, blinking. "No, just her hands and her voice. And the way she called the jet she, like it wasn't odd at all, like it made perfect sense that metal could care." Hank nodded, slowly, then asked something else. "Do you want to see the real one?" She turned sharply, stunned. "It still exists." He nodded. "She's in a place that held her, the way she held you. We didn't move her, we couldn't. She's not ours." Solon smiled, a small one, sad and beautiful. "Then yes," she said, "I think I need to say thank you." They flew out a week later, just Hank and Solon. Isla stayed behind to run the gallery. She hugged Solon before they left and pressed something into her palm. A tiny gold-plated charm in the shape of a wing. "No one should carry something like this alone," Isla had said. When they reached the site, the path was just as wild and narrow as before. But Hank didn't rush, and neither did Solon. She took every step slowly, pausing at the ridges, brushing her fingers along the worn stones of the old monastery as if they whispered stories only she could hear. And then she saw her, the original Kira, still perched in her resting place, wings splayed, nose tilted toward the rising sun. Solon froze. Her breath shuddered out of her, and Hank stepped back, giving her space. She approached the aircraft like someone approaching an altar, and for a long time, she said nothing. Then she laid her palm against the nose of the jet. "I remember this," she whispered. "I remember this curve. It was cold, but I wasn't afraid." She circled the jet, touched the canopy glass, ran, her hands along the tail, the old weld marks, the faded insignia. Then she stood at the rear hatch, the one Aras had used, and she bowed her head. When she turned to Hank, there were tears in her eyes. "I want to stay a while. Take as long as you need. I mean, longer," she said. "I think I'd like to help preserve this place. Maybe even live nearby. I don't want her to be alone anymore." He nodded. "You wouldn't be. The first person she's kept grounded." She laughed softly, and something eased between them. Not closure, just continuation. Back at the hangar weeks later, a new journal page was added to the display, written by Solon, in ink the color of sky. It read, "I was lost. She didn't ask me who I was. She just held me like I mattered, like the pieces of me would still add up to something. She taught me flight wasn't escape, it was a way of being known. And even now, decades later, I still carry the hum of her lullaby." Hank read it, heart full, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like a veteran or a fixer. He felt like a page in something sacred, a story still unfolding, a celebration of wings. The first Kira Day was never part of the plan. It started as a quiet idea from Isla, a simple gathering to honor the date of the flight that saved Solon's life, not a spectacle. Just an evening under the stars with lanterns, music and voices reading passages from the journal aloud. But word traveled faster than they expected. By the time the day arrived, over 300 people had RSVP'd from around the country. Pilots, artists, veterans, children who had never known war, but somehow felt this story like it was stitched into their own skin. The gallery prepared as best it could. String lights wrapped around the beams of the restored hangar. Volunteers prepared rows of paper lanterns, each with a ribbon where attendees could write one sentence. A memory, a name, a hope, a goodbye. Hank stood back and watched the crowd arrive. There were teenagers holding hands, veterans in faded jackets, women with strollers, and old men in lawn chairs wearing squadron pins they hadn't touched in decades. Some people wore blue scarves, others came barefoot as a symbol of humility, and in the center of it all stood Solon. She wore white, not the sterile white of ceremony, but the warm linen of home, hair loose, eyes luminous, standing beside a replica of Kira's left wing that had been transported in pieces and reassembled under a pavilion of light. She began the evening with a reading. Her voice was low but clear, and when she read Kira's words, "I don't know how much time I have, but I want to use what I do, have to be kind." There wasn't a single person who looked away. Even the children stopped fidgeting. There was a silence afterward, a sacred one. And then Hank stepped up beside her. He didn't have anything prepared. He just spoke. "She wasn't a miracle," he said. "She was a decision. Someone made a choice to love when it was hard, to repair when it seemed pointless, to lift another life even if it meant falling herself." He looked out at the sea of lanterns, hundreds glowing with the pulse of human memory. "And when I fixed her, I wasn't bringing her back. I was saying thank you. I was honoring the space she left behind." He took a deep breath. "And now, so are all of you." Solon lit the first lantern. It rose slowly, carried by the wind like a breath. Then another and another. Soon the sky was full of them. Soft golds and pale pinks and wild oranges, drifting upward like prayers written in light. One child, no more than 6, tugged at Hank's sleeve. "Do you think she can see them?" he asked. Hank crouched down and looked him in the eye. "I think she feels them," he said. "Like the way you feel someone hug you, even with your eyes closed." The child nodded, satisfied, then let his own lantern go. It carried a drawing, stick figures in a cockpit, smiling, and the words, "Thank you for flying me home." As the last lantern disappeared into the dark, music began to play. Not loud, not dramatic, just a gentle melody played by a small trio of musicians near the gallery doors. It was based on a fragment recovered from the flight recorder, the lullaby Aras had once hummed to calm the girl. Solon stood near the edge of the field, watching the stars reappear behind the lanterns. She spoke softly, as if to herself. "She never asked to be remembered. But somehow we all needed to remember her. Hank stepped beside her. She wasn't alone, he said. And then Isla appeared, slipping between them with a grin and a small handheld radio. "Guess what?" she whispered. "We just got clearance. For something?" "What kind of something?" Hank asked. She raised an eyebrow, and then the sound came. From above, from behind. It wasn't the whine of a drone or the thump of a chopper. It was wings, metal, rotating, real. 2 restored A-36s flew overhead, escorted by a single experimental craft that bore the same tail design as Kira. A tribute, silent, powerful. The crowd gasped, people cheered, and Solon laughed. Tears on her cheeks. As the aircraft banked and tilted their wings in salute, one of them released a small burst of biodegradable petals, white and blue, falling gently like snow over the field. Hank looked up, and for a moment his chest ached with a joy so large it almost hurt, not because Kira was above them, but because she was in them. Every lifted face, every outstretched hand, every whisper of, "I remember." Later that night, when most of the guests had gone home, a small group remained in the gallery. Solon sat in front of the journal. She didn't speak for a long while. Then she looked up at Hank. "I want to expand this," she said. "Not the exhibit, the story. I want to create a foundation, something for girls who think they're invisible, for kids who've lost their names, for veterans who don't know if they still have worth." Hank nodded. "I think she'd like that." Solon touched the glass of the journal once more. "She taught me what flight really means." And Hank whispered, "She taught us all." The letter tucked beneath the seat, it was Isla who found it. 3 days after Kira Day, she'd returned to the hilltop site alone, something quiet pulling her there, like an unfinished sentence. The monastery ruins were still, sun-warmed and fragrant with late spring flowers that had crept up between the old stones. She walked without purpose at first, letting her thoughts settle after the whirlwind of the celebration. But as she passed the jet, still resting like a guardian carved in silver, her eyes landed on something unusual. A corner of fabric, wedged beneath the pilot's seat. Dust-covered and delicate, carefully she eased it free. It was a small canvas pouch, olive drab, stitched shut with black thread. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a folded letter, its paper thin with age, but protected from the worst of the elements. On the back, a single word, for her. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Aras's. A letter never meant for military archives or public display. Just words from one soul to another. Isla read it once, then again slower. By the end, her heart felt like it had dropped gently into her stomach, where it would stay and warm her. For days, she brought it back to the hangar. Solon was waiting there, polishing the edge of the replica's wing. When Isla handed her the letter, Solon didn't speak. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, and read it under the slanting afternoon light. Tears came halfway through, but they weren't sharp. They were soft, almost grateful. "Read it aloud," Hank asked, joining them quietly. Solon nodded. She cleared her throat and began. "You probably won't find this. I don't know if anyone will, but I need to believe you might. Because I've tried everything else. I've tried silence, but the echoes won't let me sleep. I've tried logic, but love isn't logical. So I'm writing this for the girl, the one with the silent tears, the one who curled her fingers around, mine like she was holding the sky together. I don't know her name, but I know you gave her something I couldn't. You gave her flight. And it wasn't just altitude, it was belief. It was dignity. You didn't have to. That jet was broken, grounded, abandoned, like me, like her. But you looked at that pile of parts and saw someone inside it, and now you've made her whole. I can't repay that. But I can promise this. If I survive this mission, I'll build something in your name. Not a statue, not a wing in some Air Force museum. I'll build shelter, for the lonely, for the cracked, for anyone who's ever wondered if the rust inside that made them useless. I'll build what you were to me, not a machine, a miracle I got to witness. No one spoke after she finished. The letter sat between them, simple and profound. Idla stood and quietly placed it into a new display, next to a new plaque, etched in the same faded serif type as the original journal cover. It read, "She was never just a jet. She was always someone." Later that year, the foundation Solon had dreamed of opened its doors, not far from the hilltop, just close enough for the wind to carry a song between the old stones and the children playing in the courtyard. They called it the Kira Project. Inside were hangars-turned classrooms, studios filled with soldering tools and sewing kits, old turbines converted into reading nooks. Girls and boys who'd spent years learning to shrink finally had room to expand. Every wall held words from the journal, every door opened to a possibility. Veterans were brought in as mentors, not to lecture, but to listen, to pass on stories, not orders. And in doing so, they began to heal too. The first graduation was quiet. 6 teens, one with prosthetic legs, one with a birth certificate that only said unknown, one who didn't speak until her 3rd month in the program, another who once lived in her car, and 2 more who had never before been told they were brilliant at anything. But on that day, they stood in front of a crowd of parents, guardians, and mentors, each wearing flight jackets donated by Hank himself, stitched with patches that read, "I was rebuilt." The ceremony wasn't flashy, just stories. Each student stepped up to a microphone and spoke not about where they were going next, but about what they remembered most. The feeling of being handed a toolbox instead of a diagnosis. The moment someone said, "Take your time, but don't you dare give up." The night they all fell asleep in the hangar under Kira's projection lights, dreaming together. Solon stood at the podium last. She looked out at the crowd, at Hank, and Isla sitting near the front at a row of veterans blinking back tears, and then down at the dusty blue scarf still tied around her wrist. "I don't think we're meant to be fixed," she said. "I think we're meant to change, to evolve, to let our broken parts shine through us like the stars through a cracked canopy." And then she reached beneath the podium and lifted a small model, a new aircraft, built by the first cohort, not sleek, not perfect, but breathtaking. On its side was painted one word, Kira. The crowd rose as one. Applause, laughter, tears. It wasn't a finale. It was ignition, a beginning written in reverse, built from the ashes of something lost into the framework of something loved. Hank didn't speak that night. He just stood in the back, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the model jet now suspended from the ceiling of the central hall. It rotated slowly, casting soft moving shadows over the floor. He thought about the moment he first laid eyes on her, the way she seemed to dare him to try. He remembered the hum in his chest when her systems lit up. The first time Isla smiled. The day Solon walked into the gallery and the past finally stood still long enough for the future to arrive. Kira wasn't a jet. She wasn't a mystery to solve. She was everything that happens when we believe repair is possible, not just for machines, but for memory, for grief, for identity, for love. He whispered to her then, like an old friend, still flying, huh? And somehow, in the stillness of that great hall, with its flickering lights and circling shadows, it felt like she answered back. And that's the story of a war-broken veteran, of a child with no name, of a machine that was more than metal, of one impossible repair that unraveled decades of silence and rebuilt not just one life, but hundreds. Hank didn't go back to the field for a long while. He didn't need to, because Kira was no longer just resting in a stone monastery. She was everywhere, in every girl who touched a soldering iron with shaky hands and didn't give up, In every boy who realized vulnerability could be strength. In every adult who sat quietly in a back room of the gallery, weeping not because they were broken, but because they finally knew they weren't alone. Solon eventually took over the program, full-time. Isla continued curating the journal, which by then had grown to fill 2 more volumes. And Hank, well, he finally gave himself permission to rest. He let the past land. And in doing so, he gave flight to something far more enduring. Because the truth is, we're all a little like that jet. Bent, dented, misunderstood. But if someone's willing to see past the rust, to believe in the purpose hiding beneath the damage, then what feels forgotten can fly again. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can still hear her hum, a hum.